morning and welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome you to Professor Lily Kong, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Lily is a professor in geography at the National University of Singapore, but she's also the Vice President of the University in Global Relations for NUS. Simultaneously, she's the acting executive and vice president of the Yale NUS College collaboration, a major international collaboration between NUS and Yale University. In that respect, she's been the hub of the wheel of NUS's internationalisation strategy for a number of years. She's been a Fulbright scholar as part of her illustrious career. She's also the recipient of the Association of American Geographers Robert Stoddard Award for the Geographies of Religion and Belief Systems, a very prestigious award. Lily is also the editor of various book series and also on the editorial boards of around 15 international referee journals. Her latest book is Conserving the Past, Creating the Future, Urban Heritage in Singapore. But she's also very prolific in a number of research areas and crossing various disciplines. And among those are religion, cultural policy, the creative economy, and national identity. She's authored 8 books. She's edited 8 more, and is author of around 160 book chapters and papers. I'm wondering when she gets time to sleep in recent years. But in particular, I would refer you to her recent writings on Asian studies, and in particular an interesting book chapter she wrote in the excellent book Remaking Area Studies, which was published in 2009, which very much looked at the future of Asian studies across the Asia Pacific, and Lily focused on international collaborations in that regard. So in that respect, she's very much uniquely qualified to talk to us today about the future of Asian studies and the role of Asian universities within that fast-changing landscape. So in finally welcoming Lily to you, it would be greatly appreciated if you could put your mobile phones on silent for the remaining of the session. Thank you very much. Professor Kong.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure and delight to be here, and I'd like to begin by thanking the ASAA as well as colleagues from the University of Western Sydney, particularly Ian and Tim and Sylvia, who's made all the organisation and arrangements possible for me to be here. As Tim says, I will speak about Asian studies and in Asian universities and their potential global impacts. And I will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and perhaps we will then have some time for questions and comments and dialogue. I will begin as soon as I find the keyboard. No? Yes. I will begin with a brief introduction, followed by a discussion about the origins and decline of area studies, as well as the revitalization and remaking of area studies. I will then focus very specifically on Asian studies as a particular formulation of area studies and its evolutions within this larger context of how area studies has grown, declined, and is being remade. I would then like to focus very much on the changes as I see them in higher education in Asia, and 6 particular trends especially, and what I think are the implications for Asian studies. And I will then conclude with some commentary on what I see to be the opportunities and challenges for Asian studies in this context of changing higher education in Asia. So I go back to 1997, when the Ford Foundation, together with the support of the Social Science Research Council in New York, initiated a revitalization of area studies with a view to reframing what area studies means when the very categories of local and global are constantly being renegotiated and reinvented. This was a formalization of scholarly rethinking about what area studies stood for and its continued place in the academy. Since then, numerous scholars have contributed their perspectives whether as part of this particular Ford Foundation SSRC initiative or stimulated by it. As a geographer, I was also particularly interested in related but parallel reflections in another discursive domain where geographers were rethinking what a new regional geography might look like. The early correspondences between area studies and regional geography were strong, but like area studies, regional geography fell out of flavor for a time. And geographers in the late 1990s into the 2000s were also beginning to think about what a new regional geography might look like. I refer particularly to the work of my colleague James Sidaway at the National University of Singapore, who sought to think about the commonalities and divergences between area studies and geography. What I'd like to do in this paper is to focus on Asian studies as a particular formulation of area studies and consider how a new Asian studies is evolving in a re-emerging Asia, one where significant changes are taking place in the higher education landscape. In particular, I examine how the structural and institutional changes in higher education in Asia offer significant opportunities as well as challenges for a new Asian studies. And in this regard, I hope to engage with those scholars in Asian studies who, in the words of another colleague of mine, Gobing Lan, says, have sought to find afterlives for area studies by pointing to regionally located scholarships as alternative sites from which Euro-American-centric visions can be denaturalized. I'd like to just add a small caveat here, which is to say that I don't ordinarily describe myself as an Asianist, and for the most part of my academic life, I've really engaged with other geographers, fellow geographers, rather than with Asian studies scholars as such. I see myself as a sort of interdisciplinary geographer, by which I mean that I'm primarily interested in spatial questions, but I adopt a very open attitude towards incorporating, where appropriate, other disciplinary ideas and perspectives in my own work. I see myself as such an interdisciplinary geographer, particularly interested in studying Asia with Asian eyes. I also should add that my self-identity is very much shaped by my work as a long-time academic administrator, which has led me to sharpen my interest in higher education developments. So from these dual positionalities as a geographer, a scholar of Asia, as well as an academic administrator, I'm interested to think about these two dimensions of Asian studies and higher education together. I would like to now turn attention to the origins and decline of area studies, and in this regard, I suspect that I will be going through grounds that many of you are familiar with, but necessary nonetheless as a sort of context setting for what I'd like to speak about in relation to Asian studies. Now, just as geographers in imperial Europe played a central role in producing knowledge for the colonial masters, area studies specialists informed an increasingly global America in the Cold War years. Indeed, the origin of area studies can be traced to the post-World War II years, during which Europe and America's need to gain knowledge about other places in the world initiated the development of area studies. Ray Chow talks about how it was perhaps the military's interest to understand other areas in the world that spurred the development of area studies in the United States. Indeed, tension between the US and the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and concerns about the spread of communism were key factors during the Cold War years, which drove America's demand for knowledge on Russia, on East Asia, on Southeast Asia, and so forth, and resulted indeed in collaborations between American intelligence agencies, universities, and private foundations. Area studies, thus influenced by Euro-American strategic interests, bore certain characteristics. First of all, they were very much determined by political needs. There was a very strong focus on social change, on nation building and economic development, and there was no interest in exploring, for example, the classic literatures of an area. Because of these sorts of interests, the faculty of area studies programs were very often dominated by political scientists and economists. At the same time, another characteristic of area studies of this period was the comparative approach to other non-Western parts of the world in which Western civilization was held as the standard. Other areas were perceived as developmentally behind the West. Area studies, as carried out through the lens of the West, did not acknowledge the coexistence of alternative modernities, including forms resistant to the Euro-American model of modernity. Areas were heavily defined by their boundaries and were viewed as relatively immobile aggregates of traits, with boundaries that would remain permanently fixed. Such an approach resulted in a static view of culture and geography, with culture perceived as inert beyond the boundaries of an area. This particular bounded, static view of areas and identities was consistent with a Cold War mentality and a geography of fear and competition. The epistemological and political basis of area studies have been severely questioned over time. First, with decolonization and post-colonialism, scholars began to critically examine the epistemological foundations of a field of study born out of imperialist motives to gain knowledge for enhancing the power and strategic position of a nation over others. Second, critics also pointed out that the very categories of analysis in area studies were heavily influenced by Western colonial ideas and perspectives and the geopolitical categories they shaped. For example, what constitutes Eastern Europe and what it stands for, what is Southeast Asia, and so forth. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe was no longer seen as a meaningful category and became increasingly replaced with Central Europe. Third, the rise of globalization discourse and the emergence of new fields of study such as cultural studies has had a destabilizing impact on area studies. Cultural studies frames the study of issues such as identity in terms of transnationalism, in terms of mobility, in terms of the crossing of boundaries and borders, unlike area studies, which was structured according to geographic and cultural boundaries that were seen as static. And finally, whereas area studies had depended heavily on federal and Cold War funding as governments with international interests poured money into area studies programs, the weakening of colonialism and the decline of the Cold War meant that area studies programs could no longer enjoy the funding they used to receive. At the same time, the rise of fiscal conservatism caused private agencies and foundations, which used to fund research into area studies, to reconsider their commitment to doing so. As a result of shrinking funds, area studies as a whole began to languish. The sort of critique of area studies and the sense of crisis that was created has found recent relief. And this is largely because of changing economic, political, and social circumstances yet again, as well as the shift in epistemological flavors as such. This time, the changing circumstances take the form of rapid globalization. Whereas some are concerned about the world becoming more homogeneous with globalization, others acknowledge quickly that individual areas continue to have their own distinct and unique characteristics and qualities, and attention has been drawn to the critical importance of locality in this regard. Area studies is therefore re-emerged as a significant field of study, perhaps even more so today, as globalization connects the world in complex ways. These interconnections amidst global flows of economic, political, and social activity are site-specific, and to be fully understood require the understanding of cultural and historical contexts that area studies has always been well equipped to produce. Scholars have highlighted how globalization should not be taken to imply that local regions and areas are insignificant. Indeed, local sites retain their importance as places where people create meaningful experiences. Globalization may actually intensify and foreground geographical and sociocultural heterogeneity, so that even in an era of globalization, understanding local contexts and the interaction between culture and individual places remains necessary in our effort to understand the world. These conditions have contributed to the revitalization and renewal of interest in area studies. In epistemological terms, a corresponding shift has been apparent. As my colleague Gobing Lan argues, I quote, "The epistemological rules of the day appear to be about a search for diversity rather than similarity, an eschewing of Western and nation-state frameworks, and a rejection of the possibility of any bounded geographical and identity conceptions in the current world. Consequently, there have been efforts to recenter knowledge production so that areas outside the Euro-American centers exist alongside those centers and create alternative social scientific discourses, alternative epistemologies, and alternative theories. And in this view, knowledge production needs to be polycentric and needs to go beyond its knowledge needs to go beyond its Eurocentric legacies. Here, the call to recenter knowledge production does not amount to the nationalist or even nativist contests against the dominance of colonial scholarship during the decolonization era. Rather, in this resurgent phase of area studies, the nature of the endeavor has also been remade. How exactly has this endeavor been remade? This remaking has diverse genealogies and takes multiple forms, sometimes from within the area in question and other times from without. One formation is precisely to interrogate the geographical boundaries of areas as such. And here I refer to Arif Derlich's arguments about how geographical areas and regions are no longer discrete, as globalization has resulted in global and transnational networks that link countries and areas. These networks are themselves sites of economic, social, political, and cultural activity, and area studies scholars thus have to take into account connections that transcend boundaries. To that extent, you see the emergence of a sort of transnational area studies, to which I will return later. All this is also related to the growing awareness amongst area studies scholars that the nature of areas is in itself constructed, and so there is a willingness to now cross such conceptual as well as geographical boundaries in their research. Further, there is also a related formulation of the new area studies as involving a move away from its origins as a Western project of modernization towards the exploration of grassroots globalization or globalization from below, to explore the grassroots reality of ordinary people as such. And finally, I would also add that this particular formulation of a new area studies has also seen an internationalization through the inclusion or the greater inclusion of local and regional voices. Again, something that I would like to return to in much more detail later. While I've spoken very much about area studies in general, in particular, Asian studies and its evolutions reflects very much this sort of history of the evolution of knowledge and knowledge production. Like other regions, the study of Asia in the old area studies tradition used to be motivated by political considerations and defined and conducted mainly by Western institutions. In particular, compelled by the need to know the enemy, so to speak, the American government recruited experts on Asia during the Cold War who were trained in local languages and knowledgeable about local societies so that they could serve as advisors to the government. For Southeast Asia in particular, further expansion in the field of Southeast Asian studies occurred as a result of concern over the spread of communism in the region and efforts to contain it. Yet this particular domination of Western voices and institutions was not total, and as highlighted by other scholars in relation to Southeast Asian studies, In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, there were indigenous voices vigorously contesting the dominance of colonial scholars in mapping out the field of Southeast Asian studies. But the trouble was that many of these sorts of more indigenous intellectual movements were criticized for being Asia-centric, ironically, and were thought to lack in impartiality and secular objectivity. What this reflects really is a sort of universalist model of knowledge which is implicitly Western and perhaps, more than perhaps, insensitive to sociocultural and socio-historical contexts of knowledge production. By the 1990s, Asian studies suffered from a lack of funding that came with the post-Cold War decline. And there was a diversion of funds from government and private foundations towards other research areas. But the world order has changed yet again, and Asia has gained increasing international prominence in world affairs. Of course, we all refer to China's modern economy and other emerging Asian markets wielding significant economic influence. At the same time, Japan's economic struggles and wars are being carefully watched for its impacts on the region and beyond. You get the periodic troubles in Tibet, the political reforms in Myanmar, the Islamic fundamentalism elsewhere in the region. All these are just some examples of the global implications of significant regional political and economic events and changes. And in the context of such changes, you find that there is a great deal more interest focused on Asian studies now than has been the case, say, in the last decade. It is thus not surprising that this reinvigoration and reimagination of Asian studies is taking place at this moment. This revisionism, providing an afterlife for Asian studies, privileges the significance of transboundary phenomena as earlier described. And so, as I mentioned earlier, instead of nation states as the frame of analysis, transnational flows and connections of people, of ideas, of capital and goods have gained favor. So a transnational sort of area studies is emerging that uses transnational flows rather than nation states as the frame of analysis. This has privileged comparative, multi-sited analysis as such. And indeed, new frontiers such as the sea and subregions and so forth have been offered as alternative approaches to the area of old. In particular, I'd like to draw attention to interest in the study of inter-Asia flows and connections, and this has grown alongside the comparative Asian analysis. Sometimes the two are conflated, this idea of inter-Asian flows and the comparative Asian studies, comparative Asian analysis. Indeed, there are commonalities, but they're not necessarily always the same. I cite some examples of this interest in inter-Asia flows as such that has actually given rise to journals, conferences, and PhD programs. The Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Journal, first published in 2000, and probably the first use of the term Inter-Asia, maybe. The Inter-Asian Connections Conference, with the inaugural event in Dubai in 2008, followed up by Singapore in 2010, and then just recently in Hong Kong in 2012. At the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, the annual Inter-Asia Roundtable, and also right now a proposal to establish a comparative Asian studies PhD program at my own university. These are all efforts that emphasize the inter-Asia flows and the comparative component as such, and all these efforts share certain commonalities, basically focusing on inter-Asia processes as such. I have some details about each of these, whether it's journals or conferences or roundtables and PhD programs. I won't go into all of them because I think you have a good sense of what they are. They're interested in the inter-Asia connections, the convergences, the comparisons as such. But I do want to say particularly that common to all of these endeavors is a particular ideological position, a position that underpins all these efforts that stems from a disaffection with earlier scholarship on Asia that comes primarily from and is dominated by Western scholars and perspectives, particularly North American and Western European scholars and perspectives. In this sense, I draw attention specifically to the proposed PhD program, which I think is especially significant, not only because it professes this ideological position amongst current generations of scholars as the other activities do, but in this particular instance, it actually tries to propagate this ideological position through producing, I quote, new generations of scholars who are alert to the importance of scholarly perspective and positioning, and are themselves able to contribute to teaching and learning from Asia from within the socio-cultural terms and milieu of Asian nations. So implicitly, this is as much about developing scholarship about Asia by Asians as it is about promoting a new transnational area studies. This reading of the developments and evolutions of Asian studies, however, would be incomplete if I didn't also draw attention to Arif Derlich's cautionary words. The focus on border crossing and transnational flows brings much value, but he also reminds us that when taken to an extreme, decentering and deconstructing categories such as the nation, the state, the nation-state, and the region in favor of transnational connections can be potentially problematic. I subscribe to this view. The reality is that our lives are shaped by both the global and the local, the transnational and the nation. While the transnational flows and connections have come to feature more prominently in everyday lives, neither has the nation-state become insignificant. So I think that a new Asian studies must acknowledge this as well. Now, at the same time, I too am an advocate for the study of Asia by Asians as such, but from a larger perspective, I would suggest that this in itself is insufficient, and I do not advocate it as a preferred project over the study of Asia by those outside Asia. I only emphasize this because I think that it has not received the same support or recognition, and it therefore deserves to be foregrounded and to receive more institutional support at this juncture in the development of Asian studies. I think it would be wrong to assume that the study of Asia by Asians offers us a superior ontological understanding of Asia, since this is in effect another subject position. It is the insider position as opposed to an outsider position, but it's not necessarily, I think, a superior subject position. What I subscribe to is the promotion of both insider and outsider scholarship. And here I see two possibilities. The first is through collaboration. Though it is critical that we are aware of and resist the potentially parasitic and or predatory relations between scholars. And I speak quite candidly here. I will return to this later about this notion of the work of the hands and the work of the mind. I'll come back to this later. The second possibility besides collaboration, I think, is through the scholarship of those who occupy in-between positions. And again, I want to return to this idea in more detail later because I am quite a believer in this and I want to elaborate on this. But I will leave this for a little bit later and turn attention right now to the second part of my talk, which focuses on changes in higher education in Asia and the implications for area studies. Now, at first hearing, the two parts of the talk sound like they're going in different directions, but I will assure you that I will bring them back together at the end of the talk. Here, I want to focus on what I see to be 6 key trends of change in higher education in Asia. And I think that these have particular implications for the project and the development of Asian studies. These 6 are as follows: increasing focus on international collaborations, to a growing interest in university rankings, for better for worse, a movement towards institutional restructuring and greater autonomy for universities in the region, enlarging disciplinary interests, whereas there was much focus on professional education, science and technology education, you see a growing interest in the humanities and social sciences and the liberal arts in this part of the world, in Asia. I was speaking to Prof. Wang Gangwu this morning. He's just come from Taiwan. Again, where there are lots of conversations about what the liberal arts means and whether this is something that gains more attention in this part of the world, and how. Fifth, a real focus on improving the talent pool here in two ways, in terms of attracting return migrant scholars, as I put them, getting, the Chinese back from wherever else in the world they are, for example, and likewise in other parts of Asia this is happening, but also attracting new international foreign faculty as such. And finally, in terms of student mobility, whether we're managing a brain drain or a brain gain, which way are the student movements going, and why all of these, I think, have implications for Asian studies. Before I go into each of them in turn, I just want to say something very broadly about why I think these 6 dimensions are significant for the continuing evolution of Asian studies. To appreciate why and how first requires that we remind ourselves of the fact that centers in the West have historically dominated research and teaching of Asia. Think SOAS, think Cornell, think Leiden, for example. Think of the associations, the early associations for Asian studies. The AAS, first established in 1941 as the Far Eastern Association, for example. In contrast, equivalent sort of well-known, reputable programs and associations in Asia have for a long time not had that same prominence or influence. So as Asian universities increasingly seek international collaborations, and indeed as Western universities rush equally for connections in the region, including setting up branch and joint campuses in Asia, as Asian universities seek to find their place in essentially Western-led and Western-biased university ranking systems, how will Asian universities behave in relation to the study of Asia? This is a question that I'd like to elaborate, the answers to which I'd like to elaborate on later. Will Asia itself become a center of activity for Asian studies? With what kinds of collaborations, with who? Or will universities essentially continue to privilege the metrics of success established outside Asia, with consequential implications for what is judged as good scholarship for Asia? Concomitantly, as governments offer greater autonomy and flexibility to universities, and as some simultaneously acknowledge the importance of, as I mentioned, liberal arts education, representing a nascent shift from earlier emphasis on professional education in science and technology, will Asian studies find a firmer perch? As a consequence of the greater attention, support, and space increasingly being given to humanistic and social scientific analysis. Further, as Asian universities seek to enlarge and improve their talent pool by drawing back their migrant scholars and attracting foreign faculty, and as they concomitantly attract students from Western countries, but also lose students to Western universities, what kinds of scholars, with what kinds of positionalities, will increasingly engage in research on Asia? And what about the inter-Asian flows of scholars and students, with what implications? These are the sorts of questions that I am interested in and will speak about in this next section. So let me take each of these 6 trends in turn and say a little bit about each. Or rather, I'll say a little bit more about international collaboration and a little bit less about the rest. Many Asian governments have made internationalization of higher education a top priority in their education reform agenda. All you need to do is take a look at some of the literature on higher education reforms in Asia, and you will see that internationalization emerges again and again and again as a top priority. As a result, you get all kinds of international student exchange programs and collaborations with overseas universities emphasized here at Asian universities. Indeed, Asia is among the fastest growing regions. Previously, it was the Gulf region. In terms of hosting branches of international campuses. Singapore and China are top of that list, collectively hosting over 30 branches of international campuses. Some of those universities that started out with branch campuses in the Gulf region have now turned their attention to Asia, particularly to China. International collaborations can take a variety of forms. They can center on educational programs for students, student mobility, but they can also focus on research cooperation, faculty mobility, as well as institutional sharing and staff mobility. By staff here, I mean the administrative staff. The reasons for and merits for international collaborations are many, and I cite just a few here, some of the more important ones in the context of what I'm talking about here. First, the universities seek international collaborations as part of larger urban strategies or state strategies to attract and retain talent. This is important, and I will return to this as a separate discussion later about the attraction of and retention of talent, because it is an opportunity for the kinds of scholars we attract and cultivate as Asian studies scholars. It is an opportunity, international collaboration is also an opportunity for training new generations of workers with new skills. So you find, for example, in China, various foreign universities coming together to work with China to develop international law programs in order to build those new international law skills, for example. Importantly, one of the rationale, or perhaps rhetoric, depending on which institutions we're talking about, for international collaboration is to try and educate students who are simultaneously comfortable in diverse settings, by which very often the underlying or the explicit focus is on the ability to navigate Western and Eastern Asian settings as such. Again, this is important in terms of the kinds of education that we offer to our students and the kinds of scholars that we will produce and reproduce. And also importantly, one of the reasons and merits perhaps of international collaboration is to improve universities' ability to tackle global issues through research. And here the rhetoric and the rationale is very often about how global issues are transnational in nature and no one institution and no one locality can do the research that is going to be helpful to solve or to address some of these global issues, and that collaboration is important. And again, I think this is important because it provides the platform and the opportunity for the sorts of scholarly collaboration that I was talking about earlier, that offers both insider and outsider perspectives. Another point I'd like to make is that the increasing focus on international collaborations has very often been between universities in Europe and the US with universities in Asia, but increasingly you also see a growing trend of collaborations between and among Asian universities. And again, I think that's an important thing for the development of Asian studies as scholarly work as such. So my interest here in international collaborations is in terms of what it means for Asian studies, the possibilities of bringing together researchers with both insider and outsider positionalities to forge a new Asian studies, recognizing, as I said earlier, that I don't believe in one subject positionality being superior to another, but that the combined positionalities can really add to an enriched understanding of Asia as such. And secondly, my interest in cultivating and developing new generations of scholars with that quality of in-betweenness. I want to talk about in-betweenness in more detail, but because it is a theme that runs across several of these changing trends in higher education, I'm going to leave that discussion about in-betweenness to the end. In the meantime, let me continue with talking about some of these other changing trends in higher education. A second trend in higher education is this high level of interest in university rankings. They have become such an increasingly frequent exercise, and there is such a growing number of such annual rankings and related conferences held in different parts of the world. They continue to attract interests, regardless of how accurate they are as indicators of the reputation and quality of education of institutions. And given the signaling effect such rankings have, Asian universities have become much more focused on improving their international rankings in the global university community, for better, for worse. There are, of course, various prominent rankings, but what I'm not about to do is promote those rankings here. What I do want to do is to talk about the criteria for rankings that tend to privilege, I would argue, Western measures of achievement. Many of those measures are things like articles that are indexed in certain citation indices, and very often these are, not very often, almost invariably, they're English language journals published out of Anglo-America. There are hardly any databases that have a place for Asian language material, for example, or even English language journals that are published out of Asia, save for a select few. So to that extent, a certain privileging of the sorts of scholarship, sort of coming out of Anglo-America with gatekeepers from that part of the world particularly, will continue in a sense to shape what Asian studies means and what good Asian scholarship stands for. Other sorts of criteria, not necessarily related to research, also, in a sense, have the potential to privilege, those countries with greater resources. Take the student-faculty ratio, for example, right? That's a key criteria in some of those rankings, and very often what this means is that it privileges developed countries with the resources, both public and private, to support the more favorable ratios. The overall effect is that Asian universities chase better performance in the criteria set by these agencies, which makes it challenging to develop an Asian studies written in vernacular languages, published in regional journals, and not written within the dominant epistemological flavors established by the West. A third trend, and I will become increasingly brief as time runs out, a third trend, trend, I suppose, is a sort of nascent movement towards institutional restructuring within Asian universities. And here what we're seeing is a policy of decentralization to allow greater autonomy and flexibility for universities. So countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, even China have seen the state beginning to loosen certain controls and monopoly over higher education, albeit differentially, and allowing individual universities to manage, administer, and oversee their own operations themselves. This autonomy, one might argue, is a positive thing, but at the same time, what it has led to is sometimes also the reverse in terms of, in the higher investments that we're seeing in higher education by the state. We're seeing a greater marketization and a greater privatization of higher education in parts of Asia. With this reduced reliance on state funding, the outcome is an increasing use of private sector principles to run educational institutions. And this, again, can have implications for the kinds of work that we do as scholars, because the pressure to focus on research that produces revenues and economic outcomes can sometimes increase in institutions which go down the route of marketization and privatization to an extreme. And so the kinds of Asian studies that can find a place, if at all, those that can find a place in such institutions are likely, are likely to be the more economically oriented sorts of questions. A fourth sort of direction is the kind of enlarging disciplinary interest that we see in universities in Asia. From South Korea to China to Singapore to India, arguably it was there in India already, there's been a great deal of interest in liberal arts education. If you read the Chronicle of Higher Education, Times Higher Education, and many of these other sorts of reports that come out about higher education developments, you will see almost every week something about how an Asian university or two, an Asian government or two, is interested in thinking about whether or not to adopt the liberal arts and to bring that within the folds of higher education in their countries or in their universities. This is a change. This is a change from a traditional focus on science and technology, a traditional privileging by parents and students of professional education, of law, of medicine, of engineering, for example. And you see this in the sorts of collaborations that are beginning to find more place in the higher education landscape in Asia, which involves collaborations between Western American universities and Asian universities that privilege the liberal arts, the humanities, and social sciences. And I cite just 3 examples here. Fudan University's new core curriculum, which they revamped a couple of years ago, that now emphasizes the humanities, central to it, requires all students to do this core curriculum. And this was done with inputs and help from Yale. Yale NUS College, new liberal arts college that is set to open its doors next year, collaboration between Yale and my own university, which also tries to shift the discourse and tries to give attention to liberal arts education, particularly privileging humanities and social sciences. The University of Michigan and Peking University's joint institute based in Beijing, which offers social sciences and disciplines frequently difficult to locate elsewhere in China, religion, psycholinguistics, those sorts of humanistic and social scientific endeavors. Such collaborations, I would suggest, are important as we re-engage with the question of Asian studies and its evolution. Why is that the case? I use particularly the example of the Yale NUS College because I know it best, I suppose, where the purposefulness of bringing together Western and Asian perspectives is both explicit and unambiguous. The intention to bring together scholars and students interested in comparative study, some insiders and some outsiders to both Western and Asian cultures and civilization, provides the platform and opportunity for collaborative work that could contribute significantly to the new Asian studies. The idea is very explicit in this college that it wants not to reproduce and replicate liberal arts education with its emphasis and centralization of Western civilizations, Western traditions, Western cultures, Western histories in the syllabus, in the curriculum, to one that is much more multicentric, and certainly one that recognizes and privileges comparative perspectives between Asia and Western civilizations as such. The approach could embrace both traditional and new area studies, acknowledging the nation and state as continuing to exercise significant influence on societal change, but at the same time analyzing the transnational connections and flows within and without the region. And the curriculum as currently envisaged offers opportunities for these sorts of analysis and study. The opportunity, I think, is tremendous, for here is an institution that has placed comparative study front and center. The potential challenges are real as well, and with the establishment of new institutions, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But what it does is it provides an opportunity to very consciously, conscientiously think about what a new Asian studies means in the context of a new institution where we can think about teaching and learning and research more or less on a new slate. It also offers tremendous opportunities because of the possibility of attracting new scholars to a new institution. And here I want to talk about how this effort within Asia to improve the talent pool, and this again is another significant trope in a lot of the strategies of universities in Asia, to woo their return migrant scholars. whether it's South Koreans or Chinese or Singaporeans who've gone overseas for their graduate studies, in fact might have stayed overseas to continue their academic careers, who then are being wooed back to their home institutions in their home countries. And this is one way, I think, of improving, enlarging the talent pool. But alongside these return migrants are also the opportunities, rare, one might argue, to also bring in new faculty, foreign faculty not originally from the regions. This is an unusual opportunity because in other parts of the world, funding is declining in universities. The opportunities to hire are getting scarcer. So when Yale NUS College advertised for 30 positions, there were 2,300 applicants, for example. Jobs elsewhere are scarce. Asia is where there's a lot of hiring happening, and I think this is important for Asian studies because it offers an opportunity that draws on the strength of scholars who have dual positionalities, that double positionality, that in-between positionality that I'm talking about, that experience of having been in different cultures, working in different conditions, bringing different perspectives to bear. Again, I will talk about this in-betweenness in more detail later, but again, I want to flag this as something that I feel quite strongly about. In fact, there are very specific strategies in countries like China, certainly in India, which try to woo such individuals to Asia or back to Asia, offering another opportunity for enhancing Asian studies. And you find this in China in all kinds of strategies. The 211 project, as it's called, which was initiated in 1995, was part of a push to restructure higher education by investing in 100 selected Chinese universities, and what it did was to put extra resources there, and some of those extra resources were very specifically for hiring. Another strategy was what they call the 985 project, which was again to develop the higher education sector further, and here it was to build world-class universities, coming out of President Jiang Zeming's declaration that China must have a number of world-class universities, and 9 universities were selected for this project. Again, millions of dollars plowed in to try and hire from overseas, very specifically. And then there are, again, other very specific programs, Changjiang Scholars Award Program, Chunhui Program, Qianren Jihua, etc., all of which try to bring scholars, particularly Chinese scholars, with that perhaps in-between positionality or double positionality back to China. The same is happening in Singapore and in South Korea. In Singapore, for example, I did a very quick count of the kinds of institutions, new universities as well as research institutes and centers relating in some way to the humanities and social sciences in the last, let me see now, in the last decade or so, there was established some 65 different institutions across different universities and beyond universities. What this does is it offers the opportunity for hiring. And I would say that those in a position to hire have a particular responsibility to think about the development of Asian studies and how these opportunities can best be used to develop and push the envelope in terms of developing and evolving what a new Asian studies might look like with the kinds of scholars that we try and educate and cultivate in students and to bring together in a collective project as such. So this leads me to talk about the student side of it, because even while we try and think about the collective project amongst existing scholars such as ourselves, we also are in the business of education. I shouldn't use the word business. We are in the endeavor of education. And in that project of educating the next generation, we too, I think, have a responsibility and an opportunity to think about the kinds of Asian scholars and Asian studies scholars that we're trying to cultivate. And here, I want to say a little bit about the in and out migration of students. Very often this is talked about with hope or with despair. The loss of students to Western countries as a brain drain, or the efforts to try and encourage students from Western universities, whether it's the US or Europe or UK, to come to Asia and to spend time in Asia. Governments are putting in monies and effort to try and encourage that flow as well. That sort of flow, I think, does not need to be talked about in terms of a brain drain or a brain gain as such. I think the opportunities here are tremendous in terms of our ability to educate a younger generation that is more knowledgeable about Asia, that occupies the dual positionalities that I want to move on to elaborate about in a moment, that these are the young people who will have the opportunity to live and work in double cultures and to bring those perspectives to bear on their study of Asia in due course. So, I apologize, Tim. I think I've taken almost a whole hour, but I will conclude with talking about the opportunities and challenges for Asian studies. I won't rehash this slide. I won't go through the slide again, except to remind ourselves that Asian studies has gone through, like the larger area studies, its rise and fall as such. But this is a moment where there is a new lease of life, due to globalization and the transnational flows that are encouraging scholars to think about a new transnational area studies and a new transnational Asian studies. But a new lease of life that is also coming about because of the rise of Asia and the attention and interest that's given to Asia and the changes in Asian higher education. There are some key differences as I see them evolving between the traditional Asian studies and the Asian studies of today. I think this will be probably intuitive to many of you, so I'm not going to say much more except to flash this slide very quickly. But I do want to move to the opportunities as I see them. And the biggest opportunity as I see it is the forging of a new Asian studies that is comparative. That is comparative in terms of the multiple sites of analysis, as I was speaking about earlier in terms of the sort of new PhD program that my own institution is trying to develop, but also as importantly, if not more importantly, the multiple sites, as in SIGHT, the multiple perspectives informed by different positionalities. The insider perspectives are not to be treated derogatorily as nationalist, as they were at one point in the past, nor I think should they necessarily be seen to be privileged and superior because of a certain insider positionality. At the same time, the outsider perspectives I think are as important, but they're important not because they're more objective somehow, but neither are they to be thought of as incapable of real understanding because they are done by scholars not living and working in the region as such. To that extent, I think that there is need for a much greater sort of collaboration that is both inter-Asian as well as East-West by nature, but also there's a great deal of opportunity for those who occupy in-between positions to take a lead in the kinds of Asian studies that they do. In collaborative work, I would want to emphasize the ethics of collaborative work. I worry very often about the kind of collaborative work where the local scholar is essentially a research assistant, helping with the logistics of local fieldwork, while the foreign scholar brings the theoretical insights and engages in larger epistemological debates. The dangers of this sort of division of labor between the work of the hands and the work of the mind, I think must be avoided very consciously and very conscientiously, and must be avoided at all costs to ensure that this is not a form of academic neocolonialism. And this is not just about the East and West, it is as much within Asia. In terms of those who bring insights by way of their in-between positionalities, I do want to talk about the in-betweenness of scholar and the in-betweenness of place. The value in these in-between positionalities is in the way in which local knowledges are intertwined with Western debates. and or the way in which inter-Asian local knowledges are brought to bear on one another. Very often these local knowledges are tacit, are unspoken, are observed, they are accretions over time. They are a part of lived experience that is the continuously produced and reproduced frame of meaning from which social life is carried on. Scholarly embedding in Western Anglo-American debates is also often best understood and imbibed through the sort of lived experience of those societies and circumstances. And so the scholarly in-betweenness is both ways. It is important, I think, and such scholars, I think, have a particular advantage and a particular ability to bring to bear the different discourses and experiences. But the in-betweenness, the scholarly in-betweenness, can also be enhanced by a physical and cultural in-betweenness of particular places. A fellow geographer by the name of Kirsten Simonsen, based in Denmark, speaks about this sort of in-betweenness of places with reference to Denmark, and I quote, she talks about the intermediary physical and cultural position of Denmark placed between Anglo-American, Nordic, and continental European spaces. And this connects with a corresponding intellectual one. In Asia, I would suggest that there are certain places that are perhaps well placed to represent the sort of small, relatively open academic communities that Kirsten Simonsen was talking about. Communities that have absorbed inspirations from different and shifting places of origin, but have also re-embedded them in interaction with local knowledges and social discourses. And these kinds of places, I suggest, might well be places like Singapore and Hong Kong, for example. The different impulses are thus connected in such in-between places, and a richer, more textured new Asian studies can emerge from the pens of in-between scholars in in-between places who have the potential to valorize different kinds of knowledge about Asia as valuable. This sort of opportunity to develop in-between scholars in in-between places is afforded in numerous ways through the sorts of international collaborations that I spoke about that provide a platform for bringing scholars with different positionalities together. It is in the focus on developing new institutions with an interest in liberal arts. It is in the focus on improving the talent pool, bringing people who have come from a particular place, gone elsewhere, coming back. I think these are all opportunities and platforms for developing and cultivating Asian scholars of Asian studies for a new Asian studies as such. But the opportunity can only be fully realized if the effects of the growing neoliberal tendency of universities to measure success in terms of university rankings and institutional restructuring are well managed. Because whatever the platforms are for scholars to do the work that they want to do, to use the sort of management speak, if you move the cheese, people will respond to that, right? So if your university rankings privilege Western metrics, and that's how you get recognized as doing good scholarship through those kinds of gatekeepers and those kinds of epistemological flavors, then people will respond to that. So despite the opportunities, there are real challenges for developing the sort of Asian studies that firstly addresses transnational connections, secondly is deliberately comparative in terms of sites of analysis, thirdly values the genuine collaborative research that does not give in to a sort of academic neocolonialism, and fourthly cultivates and educates generations of a next generation of in-between scholars, given the sorts of mobilities that are happening right now in higher education. Thank you for your patience.